Welcome to a lecture on research rigor for qualitative research. And it's important that we take time and think about the rigor, this concept that really reflects the quality of the process that we use in collecting qualitative data, managing qualitative data, and analyzing qualitative data. So I gave you a graphic organizer that has arrows that show the connection between the quantitative concept and the qualitative concept. So that's what I'll be speaking from throughout this lecture. So if I were to make a comparison between quantitative and qualitative research, I would start with the idea of validity, which in quantitative is really the truth about the cause and effect or the causal relationships in a quantitative study. So the researcher is proving, quote unquote, was the research done correctly? Was it done right? That's what external reviewers for peer-reviewed journals are looking at, and anyone who is examining that research. By comparison, in a qualitative study, we are concerned with credibility, and that's really to establish confidence that the results from the perspective of the participants is true, credible, believable. How do we do that? We make sure we have accurate descriptions or interpretations of the human experience, whatever that phenomenon is that we're studying. And really, the only ones who can add credibility or to legitimize this data really comes from the participants or the informants. And credibility requires demonstrating in one or more ways that the research was designed to maximize the accuracy of describing whatever it is that's being studied. Now, how do we do that? What are strategies or methods that we can use as qualitative researchers to ensure credibility? Here's a list that I've put together that you can use for your dissertation if you choose to do qualitative research. The first strategy is member checking, and that's really going back and asking yourself, or I'm asking the participants, is this truly your experience? I collected the data, I examined the data, now I'm coming back to you to make sure this is indeed what you wanted to portray. The second strategy is reflexivity, and that is looking inward, looking at yourself as a researcher and articulating your preconceived ideas, your assumptions, your biases. We call those things conceptual baggage. And we can bracket those and articulate those in our studies by letting the reader know where we are situated within that study. The third is a peer examination of coding, the intercoder agreement, where you have somebody either coding with you and coming to consensus, or you're coding and having somebody then look over those and see if that does indeed make sense. The fourth strategy, and you often see this in the ethnography world, is prolonged engagement in that setting. So by spending a longer period of time, you are indeed verifying, giving credibility to your data. And the next one, doing observations consistently, persistently over a period of time. The sixth strategy is triangulation. So looking at data from multiple perspectives. For instance, collecting data through interviews. 1, 2, observations. A third data point might be artifacts of some point. So you're verifying that that is indeed data that is true to the topic that's being, or the problem that's being examined. And then seventh, peer debriefing, right? Sitting down, um, having a conversation and sharing your notes with somebody to add credibility to that investigation. The second big idea that I want to talk about in rigor is the comparison between what our quantitative friends would call external validity, and that relates to generalizability. Generalizability is really, does this happen in other settings? If I take this study and I conduct it in this next setting, would the results be similar? In qualitative, we talk about transfer. So we're discussing transferability, and that's the degree to which the results can be transferred to other contexts and studies. So we do that by being very descriptive in our data collection. It's defined as the extent that the inquiry is applicable in other contexts or with other subjects, participants, informants. We provide a dense description of our participants, informants, subjects, and it implies that if we provide that dense description, we can use similar methods with the same demographics in a different location. So, does it sound like generalizability? A little bit, but transferability is really that you can do this with the next setting in in a small study. Generalizability is more widespread, larger populations. So there are some strategies that we can use to ensure transferability. So strategies for transferability, audit trails and data saturation. So audit trails are a way to document the process you used for data collection, data analysis. So you're keeping a detailed notebook document, whatever you prefer, and you are providing that step by step, here's what I did. Because that would allow the next researcher to be able to implement the same study in a different setting. So you're describing the purpose, you're describing how and why those participants were selected, what was the inclusionary criteria, how did you do it? I used a database, I used social media, I posted to the following social media pages X number of times, how was data collected, what was the duration of your data collection, how did you analyze the data? What was the process used? What type of coding? What type of analysis did you use? All of that is going to add the credibility to the study. The second strategy that comes to mind is data saturation. And data saturation, when you don't reach data saturation, it does have an impact on the quality of the research. And if you look at the article that I provided on data saturation, it does impede content validity. And content validity is asking, does it measure what it's intended to measure? Now, thinking about content validity, there are ways that we can ensure that content validity is met. For instance, in your chapter 3 of your dissertation, I would ask you to make a table, and down the left-hand column, you would have your research questions. So let's say research question 1, 2, and 3. Then in the next column, I would ask you from your instruments, let's pretend it's a semi-structured interview protocol. I would ask you to list the questions from the protocol that are aligned with that research question. So which interview questions are gathering data that will help answer that research question. And then in the third column, I would ask you to align either your conceptual frameworks, your theories, or your theoretical framework, so that I know that that came from the literature, that it was not just randomly made up, that all of this is informing and is informed by the literature. So that's content validity. So making that alignment to ensure that we have some credibility to the study. Now, saturation, that deals with data. Now, think about the word saturation, meaning too much, right? When the ground is saturated with water, that's too much. So the question comes to mind is how many interviews are enough to reach data saturation? And that's something that is discussed in that article. And really the answer to that question is when you start to hear repetition, you know that you have reached saturation. So let's say you say to me, I'm doing a qualitative study, I'm conducting 15 to 18 interviews. I am on interview 14 and I'm hearing the same answers that I've heard through the first 13 interviews. Then you may have reached saturation. Let's go through. Are you hearing the same thing, and have you collected enough data to answer your research questions? That is part of the credibility of a study, is making sure that no new data reveals itself. The third concept that I want to discuss is the comparison of reliability to dependability. So in quantitative worlds, we talk about reliability, right? So if something's not reliable, it can't be valid. High reliability will produce similar results under consistent conditions in other settings. In qualitative studies, we talk about dependability. And that dependability means that another researcher can follow your audit trail, right? That in-depth description of what you did, and they can find similar results by using such things as the purpose of the study, discussing how and why the participants were selected, how the data was collected, how long you collected the data, how the data was analyzed, what the findings were, so forth and so on. That dependability emphasizes the need for the researcher to account for the ever-changing context. So the researcher is responsible for describing those changes so that those findings can be found across time. So the brother to reliability is dependability, and to define it, it really means to ensure the findings can be repeated if the inquiry is followed in the same parameters as the previous study, right? If the researcher described it in an appropriate way. The next idea I want to talk about is objectivity, that's discussed in quantitative worlds. The partner to that would be confirmability. So objectivity is a high reliability where you can produce similar results under consistent conditions in a different setting. It assumes the truth of the findings, and the researcher is not part of that process or findings. And we know in qualitative that is impossible to do. So it's an unbiased examination of that topic. We talk about confirmability, and that is kind of when everything's in place, when credibility is in place, transferability, dependability are established, then we can confirm that the findings are as legitimate as we can as we can, make them. And confirmability is really confidence that the results can be confirmed and can be collaborated and confirmed by other research. So it refers to the degree to which the results can be confirmed. Oh, corroborated by others. There you have it. The researcher can document the procedures for checking and rechecking the data throughout the study. Another researcher could follow your plan and find similar results. If you look at Denson, confirmability builds on audit trails and involves the use of written field notes, memos, diaries, process, and personal notes, and a reflective journal. So when all of those things are in place, we know that confirmability can happen. And field notes and keeping detailed field notes is one way that we can do that. So my quantitative friends would say that internal validity, external validity, reliability, objectivity is the only way to conduct research to make sure that there are no biases involved. And the qualitative researchers are saying, well, wait a minute. We have credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability that we can use. Now, we did talk about triangulation in another setting about data analysis, but this is a really important takeaway in qualitative research, is that collecting the data across multiple data sources will then give the idea of credibility to a study. When you think about a triangle, think about those 3 points. And maybe you collect semi-structured interview data, but then you're confirming that with the literature. So that's another data point. Maybe you're also using an observation. Maybe you're also using a theory, right? A theoretical framework or multiple theories, a conceptual framework. So when you think about triangulation, think about collecting data, the same data from multiple points. And that adds to credibility, transferability, dependability, and eventually confirmability. And I want you to, as you're moving forward in your dissertation, think about, if you're doing qualitative ways you can collect that data, if you're doing quantitative, that's important how you can do that. And in a mixed methods, you can have survey data, you can have semi-structured interview data, you can have artifacts, you can have literature. So bringing that all together to add rigor to studies in qualitative data is an important part of what we do.